And welcome back to another episode of Tech Pro Unicorn Podcast. I am your host, Michael Grayson. Today we are going to talk about data. We've talked a little bit about data before, but I think we're going to go deeper in data today. Today I'm joined by a guest, Malcom Hawker, who is the former Senior Director Analyst of Gartner. He's a thought leader in the field of master data management. You might hear us refer to it as MDM, and data governance. Malcom has consulted some of the largest businesses in the world on their enterprise information management strategies. He's currently the head of data strategy at Profisee, with his goal to empower companies with the confidence and knowledge needed to become truly data-driven. Malcom, thank you for taking the time and joining us here on the podcast.
Thank you, Michael. It's my pleasure to be here.
Awesome. Before the podcast started, Malcom and I, right, whenever you get two IT guys together, before the episode even starts, we're like, we're like, data, frustrating, and I was sharing that the last decade, I always say the last decade we spent with data warehouses and databases and data lakes and data oceans and all this data, and we've collected it. And we just don't know what the hell to do with it, right? How to normalize it or really make it meaningful. And then on the other hand, we get companies that say we need to be more data driven, and we're like, well, that's a bigger leap than perhaps you're aware. So this is exciting for me because the world has just been so focused on data. We want to collect it, we want to analyze it, we want to do all this stuff with it. And here you are at a really cool company, Profisee, and you get to play with data each and every day.
I do, and I couldn't agree more with some of your high-level conclusions. I worked and have worked with a lot of companies that have done all the things you described. Right? They've collected all of their data. They've put it into warehouses. They've invested in data integration technology. They've invested in data catalogs, even maybe, or data lineage tools. And they've invested in a BI layer so that maybe they have, Burst or Click or Tableau or, insert cool, BI layer name here. And they're all great solutions. I've worked with them all. I've paid actually many of them when I was previously running an IT organization. And then they start producing some fantastic reports, and they look at the reports and say, this is crap. What's wrong? I thought we had this figured out. Hey, IT, go fix this. Right. And then, for years and years, IT's answer was, hey, sorry, I don't do the water, or I do the pipes. And that wasn't enough. And increasingly, it's not enough. Increasingly, CEOs are saying, I don't care, go fix this. And then when I was a Gartner analyst, they'd call me and say, okay, how is it possible that we still don't know whether Acme Inc. or Acme Co. or one thing or two things, right? My sales leader is telling me that our sales reports are complete junk, and I'm looking at this data, and the data is totally fine. There's no null fields here. We're able to kind of load the data. We're able to normalize the data, and our data models are pretty strong. We think they reflect our workflows and our business processes, and our application uptime is fantastic. Our ops are all running. Everything is cooking, right? I mean, we're killing it. And I've got senior leaders just saying that the reports are crap. So that gives me job security.
I love it. Yeah, I think it's a relatively ambiguous term when I almost feel like we skipped a level, right? We kind of went from we have to collect the data, and so we built data warehouses and data lakes, and we've related all this data, but not really. We've kind of loosely associated better than related all this data, and then we kind of jumped to the reporting level, right? And we've got, oh, now we bought all these fancy tools. Now I have everything I need, right? And we've kind of missed the whole chasm here, the Grand Canyon, which is the area that you guys hang out in, which is the master data management and data governance, because people don't want to. That's the hard work, I'd say, right? Around data, that's nobody wants to do the hard work. They buy this fancy tool like Tableau, and they're like, "Well, I just want to report on it and get pretty reports." It's like, well, where are you pointing that? And wow, what you're pointing it to is a mess.
Yep. Yeah, and really, what it speaks to, or what it can speak to, or what the mess can speak to, are suboptimal or potentially broken business processes. Or maybe not. Maybe the business processes are to spec. They are by design, and by design, the business processes are spewing out data that can't be reconciled or can't be effectively matched. But all of that stuff to a data and analytics leader is scary, right? Getting back to the notion of, okay, hey, IT, go fix this. When you start getting into having to understand how the data is created, why the data is created, why it's different, why it lacks common definitions or quality standards, and all those things, you're starting to ask IT people to get out of their offices, to get out of their rooms, and to start interacting and collaborating with business people. And for a lot of us, that's a challenge, right? For a lot of us, it's a challenge. So, the hard part here that you described is the gray zone that exists between pure data management and applications management, in essence, right? And that's the gray zone. And what we find in our world is that when data lacks consistent definitions or structure or quality, you name it, that's the bridge you have to go across. That's the chasm you have to jump. And for a lot of data and analytics leaders, it's tough, especially if your organization lacks the incentives for you to do it, right? Meaning, go fix the data quality. Okay, well, how do I do that? I can't tell a salesperson to do the right thing, right? I'm not incented by that. I'm incented to deploy software, or to keep the lights green on the servers and not red. Or I'm incented to hit my SLAs, or to my deliverables, or maybe I'm incented to hit some sort of data quality standards, maybe. But I'm certainly not incented to make salespeople behave correctly, right? And I love to pick on salespeople because it's easy. But I
I
mean,
like
like
lawyers. Yeah.
right, yeah, lawyers and salespeople. I mean, like, I don't. It's less easy to pick on, like, procurement managers or supply chain
Yeah.
leaders who are
Yeah.
using ERP systems,
They have a hard
because
enough job already.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, yeah, exactly. And you can't really pick on finance people because they're the ones that sign your paycheck. So yeah, sales kind of gets the brunt of all this, and honestly, rightfully so, because most CRM data is not good. But anyway, yeah, you're exactly right. You touched on some of the key issues there, which are, like, this is not easy. It's certainly not easy, and it's often asking IT leaders to get into kind of areas where they're slightly uncomfortable.
Yeah, we just did a huge presentation around, they were talking about reporting, and I had a slide up and I talked about data and governance and they were like, no, we just need to talk, we need to focus on reporting. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to talk to you about reporting unless I'm talking to you about data, right? Because the two go hand in hand. And they got kind of annoyed. The CIO was, not overly thrilled with this concept until we were done. And then he was like, oh, yeah, we have a data problem, not a reporting problem. I was like, right,
Right.
that's why I'm talking to you about data. Because reporting, assuming you have great data, reporting is easy.
Yeah.
People, reporting gets all the focus because we call it the visible layer above the water, right? But below the water is this huge iceberg of data and governance and the non-sexy stuff that makes the iceberg that's above the water awe-inspiring, which is your
Yeah.
reports. Nobody wants to care for the iceberg below the water, or they just want to
Right.
land on
Well,
the iceberg.
I would say that's slowly changing. So totally agree with you. Love the iceberg metaphor, by the way. And I've been a consultant, and I've had those conversations with CIOs about it's not a reporting problem. I actually kind of got into this space because I was hired as a consultant to answer the question of how many customers do we have, right? And when I'm a consultant, I was like, when I saw that, this is a single page SOW, I was like ecstatic. I was like, man, this is a slam dunk, right? I'm gonna kill it, right? Like, I'm gonna launch some dashboards. I'll do a little bit of data integration. I'll suck all the data, all these systems, put it into one bucket, and I'll be off to the races. And I will, this is the easiest SOW that I've ever had. And that was before I kind of knew about, before I had that eye-opening revelation that the CIO you were mentioning previously had, which is, oh man, the underlying data here is a complete mess, and we need to figure out a way to resolve this. But still, I was a Gartner analyst for almost 3 years, and still, that is a very common thought within the data and analytics space, that this is really mostly a reporting problem. When I had conversations around MDM, master data management, I would say easily a good 30 to 40% of those conversations started as reporting conversations where, I would kind of do the doctor thing, like, tell me where it hurts, right? What's wrong? Well, doc, it hurts here because my business stakeholders are saying I can't trust the reports, right? Tell me more, right? And what we would inevitably end up at was, different processes for the creation of, for example, customer data. Could be product data, asset data, location data, right? What we in the MDM world we call these domains, or you could call them objects, doesn't matter. But often around customer data, and the problems would often manifest as reporting problems. But when you peel the onion, it's a lot deeper than that.
Hmm.
But still, as I mentioned, a lot of organizations are hung up on this as a reporting thing. And if you just kind of look at the size of the BI market for software versus the market for MDM people like me honestly truly believe that MDM is foundational. That you can't do this, you can't do effective reporting. If you're a relatively large company, if you are, let's say, bigger than 2 or 300 million, if you've got more than one operating division, if you've got more than one location, it's really, really tough to do consolidated, accurate reporting without MDM. So we tend to see MDM as a foundational layer, meaning that you need to do that before you can do effective reporting. But the software market for the analytics space is like 45 billion, and the software market for MDM is like 1.4 in the last MDM Magic Quadrant with Gartner. So it's like a 40 to 1. So all the attention most certainly still goes to reporting, and I think
Hmm.
actually we're even still seeing that now. Reporting, and I would kind of loosely say the data estate, right? Not just the fancy tools, but also the data estate, the infrastructure, the architecture. And I would argue 12, 15 years ago, can't believe is that long ago, it was all about Hadoop and big data, and that was going to solve our problem, right?
Right.
That's going to be
Right.
it. Speaking of unicorns,
Yep.
Hadoop is the unicorn, although it's an elephant and it's going to solve all the problems. Turned out a lot of companies spent a lot of money on big data, and what it ended up being was a whole bunch of answers desperately seeking questions, right? And
Yeah.
now I'm seeing a lot of the same thing with data fabrics and data mesh, which is, hey, let's just deploy a data mesh or a data fabric and life will be good and we'll solve our problems and we'll move on. And it's like, okay, well, goodness, if you're not focused on MDM and governance, it's going to be awfully tough to be able to keep a straight face when your CEO asks how many customers do we honestly truly really have.
I love that analogy, right? Because the way I do when I go in, right, we operate in the ERP space, which we talked a little
Yeah,
bit about before. And if I'm talking to HR, I'm always like, how many employees do you have? You're human resources. You should know that, right? But if I ask various departments of HR, I guarantee you, everybody will give me a different answer, right? And part of it's because they're running a different report or it's a point in time or whatever. There might be all kinds of problems with the reporting aspect of it. But then also, what's an employee, right? Who do they consider an employee? Are contractors employees? Are temporary workers employees? Are employees only salaried? Are they hourly? Right? That whole like governance discussion around defining all the terms and stuff. Again, not sexy. Nobody wants to sit in a room. But until you do that and you have common definitions for what you're even talking about, you're never going to come to the same answer, right? And then
right.
people they don't believe you and don't trust you. Well, that's not the number I got. So now you've totally lost credibility. And you might have both ran the same report, but what you included as a variable is totally different. Therefore, you have different numbers, and now you guys are at odds over data. You don't go to lunch anymore. It spirals out of control. The girl of your dreams, you were going to date at work. You're not going to anyway. Um, right? And it's all because of data. Data causes bad relationships at work. No,
Well,
I'm just
the
kidding.
word the word you used is credibility, and that you're exactly right, right? And if we as IT leaders aren't at the very least aspiring to that,
Yeah.
we're going to have an awfully hard time, right? Like whether that is credibility in the report that we make, credibility in the systems we provide, in the support that we provide, whatever that is. I mean, credibility is kind of like, to me, is job one. And
Hmm.
and if you can't solve for that, that is a big problem, right? Um, So yeah, it is a challenge, most certainly. But the good news is there are people like me, and there are others like me that know this space, that know what to do, that know how to solve for some of these problems, and are out there, thank goodness, talking about best practices, talking about what you need to do in order to become a little more data driven in this regard. So we are learning as an industry, and I think we are evolving as an industry. I certainly saw that coming out of the pandemic. So I thought for sure in March of 2020, when things started to go sideways coming out of the pandemic, or,
Hmm.
or just as we were going into the thick of it, I thought for sure. I'm working at Gartner at the time, and I'm taking these things called inquiries, which is like CDOs and CIOs are calling me for recommendations and advice about governance and MDM. And I saw all of these things happening with the pandemic, and I was like, oh man, here we go, phase two, right? Like the MDM and governance is going to be pushed to phase two again, right? It'll be the thing that we get to after the pandemic's over, that we don't have to worry about. We'll push it to phase two, and we're going to focus on this other stuff. And I was completely wrong. And thankfully, I was completely and totally wrong, because what I saw happen in the market was that March, April, May, by the time June started to roll around, companies, certain companies were recovering faster, were recalibrating their supply chains, were changing how they interacted with their customers, were completely pivoting their business models, right? They were going from entirely brick and mortar to now going more direct to customer. They were changing how they market to their customers. They were changing the messaging, and across all aspects of running the business, some companies were figuring it out, right? And the story that I like to tell is that in the middle of the pandemic, Nike is one great example where they pivoted from like 10% to direct to consumer sales to now within the next year they'll be upwards of 50% direct to consumer sales. In the middle of a time of massive turmoil and complete economic uncertainty, Nike was in the middle of this pivot, and they continue to do it. And that's one great story, right? So companies, even in the middle of the pandemic, were figuring this out, and then others weren't. But the others that weren't figuring it out, that weren't recovering, and that weren't recalibrating, and weren't re-engineering their customer experiences and all these things, we're looking at companies that were, and we're figuring out pretty quickly, hey, it's data, right? We don't have our arms around our supplier data. Our supply chains are broken. We can't get anything out of China. Our stuff is sitting on boats in Long Beach, and we don't know who our suppliers are. Or we're working on a customer experience, but we don't know who our customers are. So what we saw happen is that towards the summer of 2020, I was overwhelmed with inquiries and questions coming from data leaders who said, we got to figure, you know what, we can't do phase two anymore. We can't keep pushing MDM and governance to phase two. This needs to be phase one, because I'm on the hook for a digital transformation, or I'm on the hook for supply chain optimization, or I'm on the hook for whatever my portion was of recovering and getting over the things from the pandemic. And I know, and I realize that data is key to this. So, and that momentum has continued to this day. So there's a lot of doom and gloom out there right now. And don't get me wrong, I think it's pretty much a foregone conclusion that we're headed towards some sort of a recession. All indicators are. But I still remain relatively optimistic, because even though the last time we had a recession, it wasn't a very long one, but it was certainly a recession in the spring of 2020. What I saw was people running towards MDM and data management and data governance, not away from it. So fingers crossed that continues if we do find ourselves in another recession.
I love it. So we're using words that some of the audience might not know, right? What
Yeah,
maybe we could talk about what is, in the work that Prophecy does, what is master data management,
yeah,
and how can companies, um, because maybe they're like, wow, these two guys are kind of sounding a bit of an alarm. Okay, you have me interested,
yeah,
but I don't know like what I should do. Like, because we've referred to it a bit as an activity, but we've also talked about it as a software platform. Um, so we've got kind of folks, I think, like, oh, I'm looking at the databases and sets that I'm familiar with, and my data lakes and warehouses, and I'm looking over here. over at, for those of you that are just listening audio only and can't see me doing my hand gestures, which I do all the time, I'm like going, opposing ends of the spectrum. And we're over here talking about reports. And now you're saying there's some software that kind of exists in the middle here. Maybe talk a little bit about what that is, master data management, and what the software is and what does it kind of do?
Yep. Great question. And we'll touch on governance too, because that's an important
Yep.
piece of all this. So MDM is a little confusing because it is both a noun and a verb. You just touched on this, right? It is a first and foremost, it is a discipline. It is a way of managing data, right?
Amen.
So it is most certainly and first and foremost a discipline, but it's also software. It's also a technology solution that you can go and buy from vendors like Profisee and others in the space. Um, the core kind of key definition of MDM is the way I like to describe it. It's a little bit of a pivot away from Gartner's definition. The way I describe MDM is the people, processes, and technologies that are required to enable the semantic consistency, quality, structure, and confidence in a company's shared data assets,
I
right?
like that.
Or to maximize the value of a company's shared data assets. Now, things that are key there, people, process, and technology. It's not just about technology. It's about people. It's about how they create data. It's business processes, right? It's about data integration and how data moves in an organization and other things. So that's most certainly key. A few other things that are inherent to the definition would include the notion of semantic consistency, aka labels,
Mm-hmm.
right? How we label or classify data, structure to most certainly to a certain degree, quality is key in there as well. Now we could have very interesting conversations about the kind of some of the kind of things that are evolving in the MDM space, and that you can have different quality measures by certain use cases. You can have different structures and different labels by certain use cases. That's something called adaptive data governance. That's like governance, super advanced governance that frankly most organizations don't have. But put all that stuff together from an MDM perspective, and then you layer on the kind of the key thing here, which is this notion of shared data, right? And the way that I like to visualize this when I was a Gartner analyst is using a very basic Venn diagram.
Mm-hmm.
Three circles where they overlap. And in the middle of that Venn diagram, each of the circles you could represent as a database, could be a table, could be an application, doesn't matter. It's a bucket of data within each of those one circles. The very middle of that Venn diagram where everything overlaps, that's your master data, because that's the data that appears everywhere, that is used everywhere, that is shared everywhere. And it tends to look like customer, asset, product, maybe material, supplier, employee, you already mentioned, right? So data that needs to have consistent definitions, consistent structures, consistent quality standards. Because at certain levels of the organization, the higher up you go within an organization, if people within those roles, your CEO, your CFO, asks, how many customers do we have? There can only be one answer at that level, right? You can't say to your CFO, well, it depends. Is marketing asking or is finance asking? Right? But that's how a lot of organizations operate, and it's a challenge, and it drives CEOs nuts. Right? This gets back to my story before about I got hired just to answer the simple question of how many customers does an organization have, right? When you get lower in an organization within specific operating groups or divisions or departments, it's natural, I would argue, it's natural to have different definitions of who a customer is, right? In a sales or marketing perspective, the customer could actually be even a prospect, maybe not even somebody who's paying you, and that's okay, right? It could be somebody who's paid you in the past but not paying you today, and on and on. There's a lot of different definitions that can exist at more of an operating level. But again, if you as you move up within an organization, those differences need to dissolve
Mm-hmm.
because again, at the highest levels on your annual reports, right, or your rolled up dashboards that are going to C-level people, again, there can really only be one answer. So that's MDM in a nutshell. Now, MDM software exists to provide for configurability and scalability and extensibility of the management of the business rules that enable the data quality, that enable the semantic consistency, that enable the single store of data for the use to support MDM use cases. So MDM software is really about allowing and providing for a configurable, scalable solution to allow you to configure business rules related to data quality, configure business rules related to data integration, right? Configure business rules related to your data structures, your data taxonomies, meaning your hierarchies, right? Inherent to a lot of this is the notion of hierarchies as well, because if you're managing one customer, you also need to manage how customer A relates to customer B relates to customer C. Those are hierarchical relationships often that exist, whether that's B2C or B2B. It doesn't really matter, right? So MDM software exists to allow you to manage a set of business rules to maintain consistent policies for master data. Now, those policies are manifested in the form of governance, right? I've been using the phrase business rule, right? How do I know that Acme Inc. and Acme Co. are one thing or two things? How do I know whether that information is correct? What are my minimum quality standards for that record, right? What structure do I expect to see against that record? What are various attributes of that record that are used widely across the organization? Those are all governance decisions.
Mm-hmm.
You touched on this earlier. How do I define a customer is a governance decision, right? And those decisions, those exist as, or optimally should exist as data governance policies that are written, codified, managed by some form of a data governance committee or a data governance group that is chartered with defining all of those business rules that would be captured and managed within an MDM platform. They could also be captured and managed within a data quality solution, or maybe a data integration solution, or maybe those BI solutions as well. So it's not just MDM that is helping ensure a lot of these things. It's an important piece of the puzzle here, but there are other tools that are part of the data management estate that can help fulfill and manage for data governance. But the key difference with MDM is this: it's not all data, right? It's not all of your data. It's not managing for data quality rules for every nugget of data, every field, every attribute.
Right.
I work with like ridiculously large companies where their master customer record is like fewer than 12 fields of data. But the 12 is what's used everywhere, right? So again, visualize that Venn diagram. It's the middle of the Venn diagram. It's not all 200 fields of your customer record in your CRM system. It's not all 80 fields of your customer record in an ERP system. It's just the fields that are common across them.
I love it. Yeah, that's key. I think people get overwhelmed whenever we talk to a new customer, right, and they're changing ERPs. The first thing they all agree on is, man, we can't bring all this garbage data with us, right? Whether it be historical, many of these companies have merged or their business has changed, their data has changed. They've done a piss poor job, for lack of a better, more appropriate technical term, in in kind of managing how they deal with the business process around what data gets entered. There's lots of duplicates. There's no standardization. There's no tools to check whether they have, six. Like IBM is my favorite one. You go to any vendor database, right? Because most people use IBM and for something, and you go to any company and you type in IBM, and there's hundreds of vendors, and I'm like, how is there hundreds of IBMs,
Right.
right? Like,
Yeah.
what are you doing? How do you know what's for what? And they're like, oh yeah, we just have to, read the invoice, and we go on this quest every time we get some sort of interaction with this IBM record in our vendor masters. And I'm like, how about we take the time and we figure this out and clean this up and better and establish processes for how different addresses are managed within your vendor master and stuff. And they're like, no, we'll just leave it the way it is. There's just this resistance to like deal with this. And I'm like,
Yeah.
you understand the amount of time you waste every time you interact with this one line of
Yeah.
data. You're totally like paralyzed, and it takes you 10 times as long as it should to figure out what to do with it. And then you can't do things like OCR because, right, OCR is an automated process. It's trying to key the vendor in. It goes, well, shit, I don't know which one of these 100 IBMs it is. So it kicks it out, and then you're dealing with exceptions. Like data drives, you don't think of it as like being business process related, but bad data really corrupts and creates so many inefficiencies beyond just sitting in a database as, a poorly managed piece of data. It results in just all this craziness, whether it be in HR dealing with, you know, employees and temporary employees and who's an employee and who's not, where do I put them? And, that's a conversation around employee, but it's really a conversation around data.
It's a conversation around data. It's also a conversation around processes and how those employees got onboarded, right? And what business
Yeah.
rules were applied during an onboarding process. And the same could be true for a customer or a supplier or on and on. So, this is what I was touching on earlier, which is, if sometimes the business processes can be broken, but other times they can be that way by design. And
Hmm.
that's okay, right? If you're a highly decentralized organization, right? If you were like a Berkshire Hathaway, where you are this loose collection of organizations that are all chartered to work their own way and do their own thing, right, with their own business rules, and you kind of take more of a holding company type approach. That's okay. That's fine. But when talking about ERPs and maybe a lot of your clients, particularly in the healthcare space and most certainly in the manufacturing space, what companies are figuring out is that there are economies of scale here, right? Like, why should the
Yes.
IBM example is a great one, right? But there are more slightly mundane examples of I will always just say like Acme Co versus Acme Inc. Right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of problems right now with global supply chains. There's a lot of problems with companies who don't understand what their supply chain risks are. Like how often are suppliers being duplicated? Or what does my supplier relationship really look like? I think I'm getting supplies from three different companies. Lo and behold, they're owned by the same parent company. If the parent company goes bankrupt, we're in deep doo-doo. Right. So yes, a lot of these things touch on business processes,
Hmm.
and they most certainly touch on data. Uh, but to answer a previous question that I didn't really answer, you kind of inferred of like what does MDM kind of look like architecturally, and where does it kind of live? I think you asked that
Hmm.
question.
Hmm.
Typically, what we will see is MDM is a data hub, right? And it would sit kind of well, I guess this is more of a logical description of where MDM lives, is that it is a separate data hub that will sit on top of source systems of data, right? So you can imagine a CRM, an ERP, other creators of data, other systems of creation for customer records, supplier records, employee records, you name it. You could have multiple versions of Workday, for example, creating employee records and on and on. Typically what will happen is organizations will say, okay, we need to fix this, and there's a couple of different ways to fix this. We may be able to horizontally integrate all these systems together and create some consistency around workflows, where we tie a CRM system and physically link it to an ERP system. Like that's a bit old school, right? Where you make a data integration between applications to say, okay, customer record gets created in a CRM, and then the minute we have a contract, it gets pumped over to an ERP, and the data moves directly from the CRM system to the ERP system. That'll work with a relatively small company where you don't have multiple ERPs or multiple CRMs. But when you start getting into multiples of things, that creates a bit of a spider web really, really quickly, right? If you're trying to tie those systems together. So typically what we see is MDM will be deployed on top of all of these systems, right? Where it is a separate data hub where a small subset of data, that master data, the keep thinking that Venn diagram again visually here, that where a small set of data is replicated out of the source systems and into that thing, the MDM, that is sitting above them. Now, at a very, very high level, there are two kind of what we call styles of MDM. A great beginner style, a great way to get started with MDM, is what we call more of an analytical style of MDM, where what you can imagine is that if we were drawing a PowerPoint here, if we were drawing an architecture diagram, where let's just say take the example of a CRM and an ERP, where the arrows are coming out of those systems and they dead end into an MDM. That's it. The data just goes into an MDM, where the sole purpose in that analytical use case is to look at Acme, Acme Inc., Acme Co., Acme LLC, Acme and Sons, and to say, okay, wait a minute, is that one thing or is it four things? And if it's one thing, then what we can do is create a new master ID and maybe even create a new master record that is used often in an analytical use case as more of a stub than anything else. It's just a placeholder to allow you to create, in essence, what is a lookup table. right? Between those 4 source records and some new master record that says, okay, all these 4 source records, these record IDs should be linked to some new master ID that could only live in the MDM, which is fine, so that that MDM can now be pushing data into some BI layer so that if you run a report for Acme Inc., you get aggregated data for all 4 of those records, where you could go back into transactional systems to pull transactional data for any one of the 4, but make sure that it was aggregated to the same one master record. So instead of having 4 rows of data, you've got 1 row of data and life is good. That's an analytical use case. Also, for a lot of companies right now, the words that they are using are 360. We want a 360 of customer, a 360 of supplier, a 360 of whatever, 360 of something, right?
Yeah.
Where if you had that single master ID, if you were able to know that Acme, Acme Inc., and Acme Co., or maybe Joe Smith, Joseph Smith, JJ Smith, with slight variations in spelling, you name it, doesn't really matter. If you know those things are one thing, then at the very least, what you can do is to create a report to show aggregate views, accurate rolled up views of your relationship with that supplier or that customer or where that asset is being used or where that employee is currently working and on and on. That use case, that analytical use case, can be incredibly valuable to companies. Just simply having the visibility can be incredibly valuable, right? The first time I ever did MDM, all I did, the first time it was successful, the first 3 times I tried, there were dismal failures. We spent a lot of money with consultants and a lot of money on software, and it didn't get deployed, and I learned the hard way. But the first time that I had any success with it is all I did was build an analytical MDM where within our Salesforce instance, we had multiple records for Acme Incorporated, multiple. But no matter which record I was on, anytime I clicked a show me open opportunities, it popped up this window that showed all the opportunities for the 5 different versions of Acme, all rolled up into one view. So a salesperson could say, aha, I know where the opportunities exist across our lines of business where I didn't have that visibility before. That's gold, right? It didn't solve for the broken source data, didn't solve for the fact that we had 5 versions of Acme when we should probably have one, but still it gave visibility to allow that salesperson to take action on something they couldn't act on before. That's analytical MDM. Those styles of MDM, those solutions can be up and running in a few weeks, right? If you can figure out what some of those core business rules are, if you can figure out how you define a customer, if you can build out some sort of hierarchical model that models relationships between customer records, you can be up and running pretty quickly. Now, there's a lot of people out there when you say MDM, there's a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder out there. There's a lot of like, oh my God, no, no, no,
Not
not
that.
MDM, not again. I tried this at company X and we failed, right? Like you'll hear that a lot, right? We tried this at company X, dismal failure. I'm not doing that again, right? And often when that's the case, if you can peel the onion and have conversations with data leaders about it, often it is the second style of MDM, which we call more operational forms of MDM, where again, visualize data coming out of source systems into a hub where that data is normalized, maybe transformed, and typically it's going to be merged. So the 4 records of Acme now become one. Now that's hard because you have to have a lot of very complex rules around, first of all, matching. How do you know when they're the same thing? And then second of all, what we call survivorship, right? Like you've got 4 records coming from 4 systems. Who wins, right? Which one wins, right? I learned the hard way that the winner should not be created at a field level. It should be created at a record level, separate thing. Because I was taking fields from system A and system B and system C, and I ended up creating what I called Franken record. I thought I had built like the world's most amazing and complex and correct way to pick how I should be creating a custom record. It turned out I ended up creating records that couldn't exist in real time and space because I
Mm.
was like mixing ship twos and big bill twos and
Hmm.
but I was doing it based off last update date and all these other combinations of who created it, what system did it come from, what was the last, blah blah blah. But anyway, merging records to create a single kind of gold master something, right? This is again an operational style of MDM where once that gold mastered record of something is created, it gets pumped back down into those operating systems, right? So the arrows here are bidirectional,
Hmm.
where often as a part of deploying that operational MDM, companies will get caught up in these galactic massive data cleanups, right? Again, which often end up giving MDM programs really, really black eyes because those data cleanups never get finished and they end up costing a lot of money. Or companies can't align on the governance needed to do it, right? Where companies will end up bickering on who wins and which the right version of something is, and it was the finance version or is it the marketing version, and you try to solve for all of this and they can't resolve all those issues. But even when you can resolve those issues, once that record is getting pumped back into a system like an ERP or CRM, chances are you probably have to change the business processes to incorporate it. Meaning
Mhm.
that salesperson can no longer just create an account record however they want. Right? You got to adhere to some very specific business rules, some very specific quality rules, so that you stop the flow of garbage in. Which for a lot of organizations is, hey, wait a minute, I signed up for MDM and I signed up for bidder data, but I didn't sign up for changing the way the salespeople manage their accounts. Right? This kind of gets back to we tried MDM and it fails. That's what happened to me. I had a CEO tell me, go fix this, Malcolm, go fix it. I said, okay, we'll go fix it. We did. And implemented MDM software, created a single version of a sales record. And then I sat down with the chief revenue officer and said, okay, yeah, by the way, your salespeople can no longer create new account records in Salesforce. Hard stop. Died. The project died. That was it. End.
Mhm.
so, so anyway,
Mhm.
long way of saying two styles of MDM: analytical, easy to deploy, quicker to deploy, can still drive a lot of value. Operational, which can drive a ton of value for organizations. Don't get me wrong, having that single version of the truth can
Yeah.
be incredibly valuable, particularly if you're regulated, healthcare. If you're heavily regulated, you need to get your arms around this stuff. But for a lot of other companies, it can be a massive, massive challenge. Not to mention, it takes a lot of time to implement those styles of MDM because chances are pretty good you're talking about business process change, which doesn't happen overnight.
I love it. There's so many lessons right in there. I love the kind of the battle scars because I think, you know, even when we tell people like, hey, it's cheaper for you if you go clean up your data, right? And you have cleaner data, makes integrations and interfaces a lot faster and better. Makes it just easier to convert you, easier to operate and transact once we're there. People just kind of like they're like, oh, do I have to? No, you could just pay 10 times more and we'll convert all your garbage and your processes will be horrible and your reporting will be junk and you'll have just spent millions of dollars. And sure, we're happy to do that too. But then they're like, okay, yeah, it sounds like I need to make the investment. It's like, yeah, you should probably
Well,
go
what
do
you
that.
just touched on is the notion of having some form of articulated and quantified business case for an investment in better data
Amen.
management.
Yes, please.
Right. And that sounds so great and it would solve so many problems. I mean, the list of things that solves is so long,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they're all important. Starting at the top, one, stakeholder buy-in, executive buy-in, executive sponsorship, getting money, right? Getting money allocated to a data management program like MDM or
Mm-hmm.
governance or anything else. That's problem number one. It solves like, hey, this is half the battle. Getting money, okay. The next thing that having a business case for investments in data solves for is scope, right? The number one thing that I see companies get hung up on after they get approval from somebody to go solve the problem is they try to do too much. They can't prioritize
Yeah.
everything because all data, if you can't prioritize what data is more important than other data, what processes are more important, what business outcomes are more important, everything becomes important. And then all of a sudden your scope balloons, right? Now, for consultants, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but even that goose will stop laying golden eggs because
Mm-hmm.
you'll get 7, 8, 9 months into a program where you are doing data discovery, you're doing data profiling, you're doing data cataloging, you're doing all the data lineage, you've pasted walls upon walls with Visio diagrams showing where all the data flows. 9 months later, the client has nothing to show for it other than a lot of Visio diagrams, a half a data catalog, a half a business glossary, a half a technical glossary. And okay, those things are great, but having a business case allows you to actually prioritize and say, okay, we want to prioritize on optimizing our supplier relationship. So I know I don't have to go and catalog every nugget of data ever made ever. right? I can just focus on that outcome of reducing our supplier costs or reducing our inventories or cross sell or upsell, whatever those outcomes are. And notice I keep focusing on outcomes, not data. I hear this all the time. When I was a Gartner analyst, I would ask, okay, well, how are you managing for scope? Oh, well, we're just going to focus on customer data. No, right? Nobody is incented on customer data. What we would recommend, what I would recommend as an analyst is focus on an outcome, cross sell, upsell, lowering inventory costs, increasing
Mm.
your net promoter score, whatever it is, right? So that's the second thing that having a business case solves for is managing for scope, which is absolutely positively critical. Like if you can solve for those two things, executive buy-in and scope, I mean that's half the battle right there. Number three things that solve for is you as a data leader, whether you're CDO or maybe you're senior director of analytics or whatever it is, you can actually show to the organization that what you did drove value.
Mhm.
You can prove it, right? You should be able to say, okay, all these things that we did, right? I would like a bonus now, please, or I would like to at the very least maintain my job, right? Like, wouldn't that be great,
Yeah.
right? So, I mean, I could keep going here, but business case is so important. But we know Gartner published a stat in the Magic Quadrant 2 years ago that 90% of of MDM programs cannot quantify the business benefit of investments in MDM. So 1 in 10, roughly, is the number of companies that are actually taking the time to focus on having some form of a business case defined for, in this case, an investment of MDM. But this is a common problem across all data management spaces. It's just not done,
Yeah.
sadly.
It's again that leap, right? People go from well, I spent all this money collecting all this data and such, and now I want to be a data driven organization. And so many times I hear that come out of C-level folks. They're like, we need to get to be more of a data driven organization. And I'm like, okay, well then there's all this work in the middle you have to do. No, Michael, we that's great, but that's not what we want to do. You see, we need to be a data driven organization. And I just look at them like, like, do you hear what you're saying? Right? Like, you want to be a data driven organization, right? There's only three words, and one of them is data. But then when I talk to you about the
uh,
work you need to do around the thing that is going to drive your organization, the other two words, you're resistant, right? So because it costs money and it takes time and it's a predecessor to the fanciness that you perceive is on the other end, right? You want the cake, but you don't want to bake it, right? Like um, it's really interesting to me because I think it's a buzzword, right? This whole data driven organization. I kind of hate it, right? I don't like it because I'm always like, what are we trying to do? Well, we want to be a data driven organization. To what end, right? What do you think the data is going to enable from a business outcomes perspective? Which is why I loved when you said, focus on the outcomes, right? Like in your business case, like what are we trying to do with the data? Just to play in data, that's great for Malcolm and me and other IT folks that we just geek out over data and we'll build queries and we'll do all kinds of cool shit because we like messing with data. But our outcome might just be we like messing with data, right? An organization really should define, like when they say we want to be a data driven organization, to what end,
yeah,
right?
it is for a lot of companies. Sadly, it is a buzzword. It most certainly, or a buzz phrase, whatever. For a lot of companies, it is. And my heart goes out to a lot of CDOs who are hired into a CDO position, like a real CDO, right? With a seat at the C-suite, right? With who is peers with the CIO, peers with the CTO, and other chief leaders in an organization, where they get into a lot of these roles, and what they find is that culturally, organizations may say one thing, but
Mm,
what they reward is something completely else, right? And if you ask me, a big part of the conversation here, to me, always comes back to incentives.
Mm,
And it's not something that we really talk about in the data management space, right? How are companies incented? I've had numerous conversations with extremely well-intentioned organizations, with CDOs and CIOs at extremely large global organizations who have said to me, with names and brands that you would most certainly recognize, who have said to me, we need to solve for better data management so that we have more of a consistent and holistic view of our customers or our suppliers at a global level, on a global level. Okay, great. Is your organization ready to accept some form of centralized data management and centralized process management and some form of centralization of these things, where today you are highly, highly decentralized? A lot of these organizations are operating at a country level where every country can basically just do whatever they want. Right? They're
mhm,
flying under the same banner and the same brands, and this, but a lot of the kind of the various departments or divisions or organizations can do whatever they want. And the answer was no.
mhm.
I'm a CDO. I got a big title. I'm getting paid a lot of money, but I am unable to force this business to act in a more centralized way, which led for a very short conversation as an analyst, because I said, okay, you say one thing, you want one thing, you've been tasked to deliver on this, but you acknowledge that the organization will not act in a slightly more centralized way. And in this case, more than one case, as a matter of fact, some of these global brands, it came down to even simple data sharing, that country A could not get, or even headquarters could not get access consistently to data to produce some of these reports. So even access was
Yeah.
was part of the challenge. So you're absolutely right. There is a data culture issue here. There's a data literacy issue here. I think where the rubber hits the road is an incentives issue, and CEOs need to understand that if you really, really, really serious about becoming data driven, right? That at some level, not all levels, some level, that data management is going to need to be centralized in some way, shape, or form, right? Where you need some sort of a COE, call it whatever you want, Center of Excellence, Tiger Team, I don't care, but where you have at a corporate level, you have funding for people, process, and technology to allow you to look horizontally, where today you may only exist by looking vertically. Until you can say that you're willing to do that and able to do that, you're not going to become as data driven as you otherwise would have been. Right now, I think you could argue and you can make a case. Okay, well, we're going to become data driven, but we're going to become data driven within our silos. But that's generally not what most companies are looking for, right?
Yeah.
Like having the most efficient silo, right, model, where the silos don't talk to each other and they're not sharing data, is not what most companies aren't going there, right? Because we all know intuitively there will be economies of scale, right? By having more centralized, let's say, relationships with your suppliers or agreements with your suppliers, consistent payment terms with your suppliers, right? Where there's economies of scale that can be realized by understanding who your customers are and where they traverse lines of business or where they traverse operating units, right? And on and on. The list here is long, right? We all know that network effects are real. They exist, right? And they most certainly exist within data, and you can mine those network effects. You absolutely can, but you can't do it on a global level without having some notion of centralized data management that for a lot of organizations just doesn't exist.
It's what I always tell folks is, I don't care what level you are. I don't care how long you've been in IT. I don't care how good of a CIO you think you are or CDO you think you are. You can't know it all, right? And you really should. Um, I think the best CIOs and CDOs and CTOs that I've seen are not the folks that are really deep and great at one thing, but they're the folks that understand the how it all joins together, right? They're the generalists that have great relationships with their teams and the business. And they're the facilitators, right? And when it comes to something like this, and you're like, okay, I should do something here. We know our data is not. We are trying to become, a data-driven organization. To me, right, the call to action is get help, right? Reach out, have a
Yeah.
conversation, talk to somebody who understands this and say, hey, here's my particular situation, call Malcolm, right? Like,
Yep.
like you're not buying the software yet, you're not buying the services, like reach out and just be like, hey, here's my situation. Can you guys help? Like, what do you guys do here? Or, and if nothing else, we'll turf you, right? Call me, call Malcolm, call somebody else in the space. And if we can't help you, then we turf you, right? And we're like, hey, we know somebody, like that's not what you need. You need this, and we'll connect you. There's so many people in the IT space that are willing to help. And I think these CIOs and CDOs get overwhelmed or feel like, well, I have to know that answer, or my peers will not value me, right? The value is in bringing the experts to the table to have the conversation, not trying to fake it till you make it. And talking about shit, no offense, out of your ass because you don't know what you're talking about. And then you become it very quickly becomes obvious that you don't know what you're talking about. Don't get yourself in that situation, right? Reach out and dial a friend.
Yep. I could agree more. And the data, at least in the case of MDM, the data most certainly backs you up. We know through multiple published surveys, including again one that Gartner published a couple of years ago, that 90% of the time MDM is being implemented by consultants. That's implementation, right? But two important aspects of what you touched on. One is strategy, and the other is implementation, and both need to exist. You cannot do MDM if you're only focused on implementation, just standing up some software. You're going to fail. If you're only focused on the strategy, kind of ivory tower, high level stuff, without being able to actually put some shovels in the ground, you're going to fail as well. You need both. But this is the tall order for CDOs and data leaders, right? Because typically a CDO will come from either an IT background, implementation, or a business background, strategy. And finding somebody that can traverse both of those worlds and have a high level conversation. Yes, this really is about storytelling. It really, really is, right? Where you can have a compelling conversation about data and about business processes and about business outcomes and make it relatable and make it digestible for other senior leaders, right? That is a real skill. It's basically pitching, it's selling in essence, right? You got to be able to do that, but
Mm-hmm.
you also have to be able to roll up your sleeves and have a slightly informed conversation about data modeling or entity resolution or what I call survivorship or fields of data or business or technical processes related to integration or quality or metadata management. You got to be able to do a little bit of both.
Mm-hmm.
And again, hello unicorn, right? Like that is a tall order for one human being to be able to traverse those worlds and do both.
Yeah.
And to your point, it's okay to go hire consultants. It's absolutely okay to hire consultants. The only kind of disclaimer that I would add, comma, you still need to have some idea of where you're going and what your business outcomes
Yes.
will be and what your scope is going to be and what your budget is going to be and what your priorities are going to be. Because unless you're able to provide guidance to your consultant, the consultants will rightfully, if they don't know where to focus, they will focus everywhere, right? So which can take a lot of time and can take a lot of money. For a
Mm-hmm.
smaller company, maybe that's okay. But if you're a large multinational and you don't have endless amounts of money and you need to be able to focus and you need to show some value quickly, yes, consultants will be an incredibly important part of the equation here, without a doubt. But I would argue you need to have some idea what success looks like and use that as a starting point to frame some sort of SOW.
I love it. Great advice. Well, Malcolm, we geeked out on data, master data management, data
We could keep going
governance.
here. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Um, so all the information that Malcolm kind of talks about, I really like the Profisee website. So for those following along at home, it's not Profisee like you'd probably normally spell it. It's PROFISEE.com. And out there, there's all kinds of cool stuff. There's a link to get the Gartner report that Malcolm had referenced a couple times. There's evaluation tools. So if you're looking at like, is Profisee the right one? There's others out in the space. There's a download that you can get like some tips on what to look for in the systems. there's a lot of partners, right, that are implementing Prophecy, and some that you might already have in your space today. RPI is not one of them. But there's Proficient. A lot of Microsoft shops use Proficient or Avanade. There's some big boys out there. There's one that I would call simply because of their name. They're called Lobster Pot. I have no idea who they are or what they do, but you want to name your company Lobster Pot, I'm going to call you. If nothing else, just to go, why did you name your company Lobster Pot? Because I'm sure there's a great story there. But very cool. Thank you for taking the time and sharing the work that Prophecy is doing and just raising the knowledge that's in the community around master data management and why it's important and how it fits in the overall. I want to be a data driven organization. I appreciate your candor and the way that you approach this complex and sometimes confusing topic.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. And you had mentioned, lastly, hey, call somebody. You can call me. Please connect with me in LinkedIn. Send me a message in LinkedIn. If you've got
Awesome.
questions about governance or about MDM or about data quality or about solutions, about providers, about anything, my job is to help organizations see the value in better data management. We truly and honestly believe that a rising tide will lift all boats. So even if you're using another MDM provider, that's okay. Call me, find me on LinkedIn. I will happily help you. Michael, thank you so much for including me and allowing me to kind of spread the word here about MDM and governance, because I think it's much needed out in our ecosystem. So thank you so much again.
Absolutely. Thanks, Malcolm.